In this presentation, we're going to look at the receptive skills, that's reading and listening, at A1 and A2 levels. In Part 1, we will look at the nature of reading and listening at lower levels, especially in relation to CEFR descriptors. In Parts 2 and 3, we will look at how this relates to the respective constructs of reading and listening at lower levels, and how lower order receptive skills are defined and conceptualized. In Part 4, we will look at some sample items from both skills and consider how lower level items work in practice. In this section, we will consider the nature of receptive skills at lower levels, in particular as they are conceptualized in the CEFR. We will look at descriptors for both reading and listening and consider some key points for the purposes of item writers. In the CEFR, language users are divided into the umbrella categories of basic user, independent user, and proficient user. A1 and A2 both fall under the basic user category. Descriptors typically emphasize familiar situations, concrete information, and high-frequency vocabulary. However, this does not mean that A1 and A2 items are simple to produce. In particular, it is important to retain the appropriate reading or listening subskills. This means that questions should not become grammar or vocabulary items. In an MCQ gap fill exercise, for instance, the test taker still needs to either read or listen to the text in order to obtain the answer. You should never be able to obtain the key through linguistic knowledge alone. On this slide, we can see CEFR descriptors for reading at A1 and A2 level. Although they both fall under the basic user category, there is still progression and evolution in ability across the two levels. An A1 level user is only able to operate at a very local phrase or short sentence level. At A2 level, there is a progression from understanding a very short text slowly, phrase by phrase, to being able to understand a short and simple text at a more inter-sentence level. It is no longer phrase by phrase, meaning an A2 user should, for example, be able to understand basic coherence between individual sentences in simple texts. On this slide, we can see the CEFR descriptors for listening. At A1 level, the emphasis is on slow and carefully articulated speech. As with reading, an A1 user operates very much at the basic phrase level. The situations will also be concrete and familiar. At A2 level, the information is still concrete in nature, but there is a slight shift in gear to be able to process information in most everyday situations as long as the phrases remain basic and the speech is clear. As we saw in the descriptors, at A1 and A2 levels, there is a strong emphasis on the basic and the familiar. Here, we will look in more detail at what these concepts mean for the purposes of item writing. Familiar refers to common situations from everyday life: shopping, morning routines, food and drink, and so on. It should also be related to personal experience. Morning routines could be discussed in a broader or more abstract sense. For example, the argument that teenagers should start school later in the day. But at lower levels, it's purely restricted to the personal domain. For example, the personal habits of the speaker or writer. It must also be suited to a global audience. There should not be any form of cultural bias. The topic should be equally familiar to all people in all regions. Concrete refers to concrete nouns, physical places, and literal activities. There should not be any idiomatic usage. Information should be fact-based and not opinion-based. One of the biggest challenges at lower levels is maintaining authenticity. The context of the reading or listening text must always be plausible. For example, if your text is a set of instructions, it must be a set of instructions that would conceivably appear in real life. In this section, we will look in more detail at the construct of reading. This is the Khalifa and Weir framework. It is a conceptual framework of the cognitive reading process. In other words, a visual representation of what is happening inside someone's head as they read. It is widely used in language testing. Starting with visual input, i.e. the text, it progresses through lexical access, to grammatical understanding, to establishing meaning. Higher level skills would then include skills such as inferencing. On the right-hand side is the pre-existing knowledge that a person brings to their reading and interpretation of a text, including linguistic knowledge and topic knowledge. This is a simplified version of that same visual. As you can see, at A1 and A2 levels, we will be focused upon integrating and targeting information at word or sentence level. We will see this in practice when we look at the examples. In this section, we will look in more detail at the construct of listening. For testing purposes, the input recording is still referred to as the text. In many regards, it is not dissimilar to the reading process. For example, lower-level processes focus more on understanding input at phrase level. The test taker will still interpret a text relative to their own pre-existing world knowledge and experience. However, questions unique to listening include issues such as whether to allow the test taker to listen to the text once or twice. Audio-only or video format is another important area. In the context of Aptis, the input is audio only, and the test takers can usually listen to a text twice. Accent and comprehensibility of the speaker pose further issues, and the extent to which accent familiarity is relevant to the target construct. A less familiar accent could make the initial decoding stage more challenging, even for proficient users. We will now look at some sample items at A1 and A2 levels and consider how they work in practice. We suggest you pause the video at each slide in order to consider what makes them suitable for their respective skill and level. This is an A1 listening item. There is a text followed by an MCQ with 4 options. The target information is concrete, and the context is universally familiar. As we saw in the CEFR descriptors and the conceptual framework of cognitive processing, test takers at A1 level need to demonstrate understanding at a basic phrase level. Notice here, therefore, that there are no distractors in the text, and nor is there any paraphrasing. The key, the second floor, appears in the text as it does in the options. There is nothing else in the text to distract the test taker from that key piece of information. In this way, the item is targeted at A1 level. Here we see an example of an A2 listening item. This is a dialogue between a man and a woman. There is an MCQ with 4 options. The options in this case all revolve around common everyday activities. Again, the key, stay at home, is not paraphrased and it appears in the text. However, we can see a progression in difficulty because the distractors now also appear in the text. Notice how key information is always contained in the next turn. Throughout the text there is a suggestion, followed either by a negation or an affirmation. In this way, text-level understanding is not required from the test taker, as we are still at the basic user stage. This is an example of an A1 reading item. It is a blanked gap fill task. The test taker reads the text, presented in the form of a letter, and fills in the gap from a bank of 3 options. Notice how each sentence is a standalone unit. Although the sentences are thematically linked and progress naturally, there is no inter-sentence referencing. This is because at A1 level, a test taker needs to demonstrate understanding at a very local phrase level. However, it is still a reading test and the test taker needs to understand the entire sentence. It should not be a collocation task or a grammar task. All options should fit grammatically into the gap. In sentence 3, for example, a test taker needs to read about the car at the end of the sentence in order to select the correct option. Sentence 2, on the other hand, would need some revision because attend the park and write the park are not acceptable collocations. Therefore, reading has not been targeted, and so it becomes a vocabulary task. Finally, here is an A2 reading task. It is a sentence reordering task. The sentences will be presented jumbled to the test taker, and the task is to put them into the correct order. Here, the test taker needs to demonstrate understanding of cohesion between adjacent sentences. However, the linking is very clear and overt. For example, he or she in sentence 3 is referring back to the member of staff at the desk in sentence 2. It is important that the links are based on clear, cohesive devices, rather than logic, processes of elimination, or world knowledge. As always, there must only be one possible order. In order to get credit for this task, the test taker not only needs to put the correct sentences in the correct place, but put the preceding and subsequent sentences in the right order too. For example, if a test taker puts sentence 3 in the correct position, but fails to put either sentence 2 or 4 in the correct place, then they have not demonstrated the target reading skill. Therefore, this task is marked according to a pairwise format. As you can see, item writing at lower levels presents a number of challenges for the item writer. There remains the requirement for an authentic text, but within the constraints of the lexical, grammatical, and thematic restrictions. Ensuring that the appropriate subskills with the reading and listening construct are properly targeted present further challenges. Please post any comments or questions in the forum. Thank you very much for your attention.